horror, and the flat-out strange from the other side of cinema. I am Mark Dickerson.
And I'm Jeremy Fink.
And today we are going to continue our series, Before Middle-earth, the early films of Peter Jackson. We have previously looked at his first three films, the early films. But today we're going to start looking at his late early films, starting with
Heavenly Creatures.
They were two young girls living in a world of imagination.
I'm going to the fourth world. It's an absolute paradise of music, art, and pure enjoyment.
What they had was friendship.
What a disgrace you are!
Your mother is rather a miserable woman.
What they needed was freedom.
Do you like your mother?
No.
What they shared was a secret.
Your daughter's been behaving in a rather disturbed manner.
What's she done?
I think I'm going crazy. I'm sure it's perfectly innocent.
The crime that shocked the nation.
People die every day. Only the best people fight against all obstacles in pursuit of happiness.
All thought it up. Aren't you clever?
We're not going to be separated.
She's uncontrollable.
Based on a true story.
It's all frightfully romantic.
Heavenly Creatures.
So here we go. So Heavenly Creatures is Peter Jackson's 1994 film, his follow-up to Dead Alive, or Brain Dead, which features the story of Pauline Parker and Juliet Hume. Juliet transfers to Pauline's school, they develop an extremely close friendship, and eventually it leads them down a dark road when they create this fantasy world for themselves, and things kind of go a little bit crazy. Heavenly Creatures is actually based on a true story that took place in a town called Christchurch in the 1950s. It was a real departure for Peter Jackson. His first three films, as we saw, Bad Taste, Meet the Feebles, and Dead Alive, were all these splatter horror kind of films, very crazy all over the place, whereas Heavenly Creatures is kind of a more refined, traditional, dramatic approach to his storytelling.
Yes, definitely. As you said, it's quite a departure for Peter Jackson from his previous films, from even the one before this, Dead Alive, from 92, I believe. But, the story, there was something about it. I assume the story that this film is based on, the true life friends that this is about, it did originate from New Zealand, where Jackson is from. So it certainly must have had something to do with why he took this on as his next project. Like many, I'm sure Jackson must have been fascinated by this story because it is inherently pretty interesting, I would say. And his partner, Fran Walsh, who he's written with since Meet the Feebles, I looked into her backstory a little bit. And apparently she was fascinated with this murder case since her childhood. So I'm sure that had a huge thing to do with it. And I was watching some interviews with Peter Jackson. He was saying, he wanted to get beneath the headlines and basically tell a story about people, which is what this movie is at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about this film as compared to the films we discussed on our last episode is with Jackson on this one, in his previous films, he kind of would create a world and stick to that world. And it was normally a kind of cartoonish, fun, wild, over-the-top world. Whereas this, we're really looking at the real world here. And even though the stylistically, the way he moves the cameras, some of his POV shots, his wide-angle lenses, can create a little bit of a cartoonish effect, we're really looking at the real world. But at the same time, these girls, Juliet and Pauline, create this world for themselves, which we see some beautiful special effects work, which is a theme that runs throughout Jackson's work, but also just costume work, different color schemes all over the place, very, very experimental and almost touching upon some of the stuff he's done earlier. And so Heavenly Creatures is notable for a few reasons other than just Peter Jackson that feel important to discuss. The first is that it was the first major movie for, sorry, I'm gonna start that over again because I just blanked on her name. Kate Winslet. Sorry. So it's notable to discuss for a few reasons outside of Peter Jackson. The first is that it was the first notable movie for Kate Winslet. Before that, she had only been doing TV, and it also featured an early performance by Melanie Lynskey, who didn't go on to become quite as major of an actress as Kate Winslet did, but is still a solid working actress. I actually just saw her recently in a Netflix original film. I believe it's a Netflix original called I Don't Feel at Home in This World Anymore, and she gave an excellent performance. But it's also notable for the fact that it was the first time that a Peter Jackson film got some Oscar nominations. Which was a new thing for Jackson, having this type of critical success.
Best original screenplay, I believe.
Yes, best original screenplay.
And this is obviously before Lord of the Rings, which basically, took over the Oscars through the next few years there. So yeah, as you said, this movie is a departure for Jackson in a lot of ways. It is the real world, which we didn't really see from him before, but it's still the world through Peter Jackson's eyes. It's still very much Peter Jackson, which, I appreciated, especially coming from his earlier films, which are so bonkers, off the wall, crazy. It's good to see that some of that still kind of made its way through, even though it's much more serious material that they're dealing with here.
Yeah.
They deal with all kinds of huge topics like mental illness. There's issues of homosexuality with the two girls.
And a rigid
murder is a big one.
Murder,
yeah.
Which, once again, we will be discussing spoilers on this show. If you're not
yes.
familiar with us, it's still a little early here, but there will be spoilers. I think something that was really interesting about this film was just the fact that it was so beautiful dealing with such dark subject matter. I found a review that Owen Gleiberman wrote, which he said, set in the early 50s in the New Zealand village of Christchurch, this ripe hallucination of a movie, A Rhapsody in Purple, has been photographed in sun-drenched candy colors that lends it to the surreal clarity of a dream. There's something bracing about the way that heavenly creature serves up its heroine's fantasies with literal-minded brute force. Which is interesting to me, even in that review. I think that one thing that happens with this movie is it's so beautiful that it can get a little bit lost exactly how daunting and horrific the subject matter is, which is, I think, that's something maybe Jackson wanted to be careful with. Like you said in the interview, he was talking about how he wanted to kind of make light about this situation, and even though, so basically, the real story is that these girls, Pauline Parker and Juliet Hume, formed a plan together. Juliet, who was from a very wealthy intellectual family, was supposed to be moving to South America, right? Or South Africa?
South Africa.
South Africa, thank you. She was supposed to be moving there, and Pauline wanted to move with her, but Pauline's mother said no, and these girls formulated a plan together and ended up beating Pauline's mother to death with a brick. And brutal murder.
Yes.
At the end, but they were both just schoolgirls. But obviously the media kind of took hold of this and it became this big thing. So Jackson kind of wanted to bring their story to light and point out the fact that even though they did this horrific thing, they were just kids.
Yeah.
At the time.
It's the trial was really like sensational from what I read. I mean, it was probably the biggest trial going on at the time. And as Jackson said, he wanted to go beyond that and really just tell a story about people. And he really brings you into the world of these two girls when they actually have their own world. I believe it's called the fourth world.
Bravnia.
In this fantasy life that they live in. There's, they're both very idealistic. As you mentioned, they both come from different backgrounds. Kate Winslet's character, Juliet Hume, she's more, like you said, like sort of like a posh, somewhat privileged young British girl. And Melanie Lynskey, who plays Pauline Parker, she is a little more working class, and she's from New Zealand. But they both, they meet and they form this bond together, and their own world, really.
Yeah. And a really stunningly photographed world. It has these real like Rococo kind of influences, like you might see in a painting by, and I'm gonna butcher this name, but like a Jean-Honoré Fragonard or someone like that. These 18th century
film, like you
French
said.
painters, beautiful. And these Rococo influences, I think you could even see carry over. Once again, a big thing with Jackson is I feel like he, more than maybe other filmmakers, you can really see a progression in his work. Where certain influences crept in. So in this one, this fourth world that they created has this beautiful Rococo look that is kind of similar to like a Rivendell or something like that we would see later on in the Lord of the Rings movies. And for me, I think that the effect that had is So I'm a big Nabokov fan, and so it had the effect that almost like Lolita had, where it was just so beautiful that you had to get through the beauty to see how ugly it really was at its core. You know, you had these sweeping, huge, beautiful shots, but it's ultimately a murder story.
Right. And besides character, I feel like this film is much about, how that line between dreams and reality can become blurred, and sometimes in truly tragic and horrific ways, as they show in this film. Because I feel like Jackson, the person, is a very idealistic dreamer, just from interviews I've read and seen of him. He just, he seems like he has these ideas that he just wants to get out there and into the world. And, he's very much a type of person that makes his own world. So I feel like this movie, though it's based on a true subject, is probably very personal for him in a way. And it feels personal when you're watching it.
And he has a lot of respect for the idea of the dreamer in this,
Yes.
even though the dreamers themselves aren't necessarily of the highest moral character.
Right.
He has respect. He treats the characters with respect.
Although on that note, I was going to say that this film, it seems very sympathetic actually, to the girls, but it also doesn't shy away from, the more sadistic qualities of the two girls. He constantly alludes to how unstable they may actually be and how things will eventually take a sadistic turn. There's a few examples I saw. There's a photo of Orson Welles that he kind of lingers on, it being taken away on a stream, and kind of like an eerie moment. And also when Pauline acts like, there's a moment where she acts like she's dead, and where Juliet really believes her, and it's kind of like this this kind of scary moment there. Also, the way they linger on Juliet's first meeting with Pauline's mother. There's just like these little things I noticed. I took note of that kind of, they all kind of build up to that ending.
So I have a question for you, Mark. Would you consider this to be a violent film or no?
No, I would not. And I say that with, a pretty solidness, because I feel like that last scene, I mean, we're going to talk about it, I'm sure, but I just feel like, reading the actual event, what befell this woman, the way he presented it, I feel like was actually very respectful, as you said, and it was done more artistically. But also, the movie itself has a lot of flourishes and there's a lot of dreamlike qualities. But when it comes to that scene, that last moment that this movie culminates with, he really just kind of lets it play out. It's very realistic in a way, but he doesn't show, because the actual killing, as we mentioned, was very brutal. I believe she was, I don't remember the exact number, but the mother was bludgeoned many times with the brick in the sack. I could just say a number here, like 45 times, something like that.
Something excessive.
It was very excessive, because once they started, and I was reading about this, how they actually described it, the two girls, like once they started, it was like, we have to finish this, and they just kept going and going, and while she was pleading, and so it's extremely brutal. It's very, so the way he handled it, the way Jackson portrayed it in the film, I feel like was respectful. I didn't feel like he went over the top. I didn't feel like it was overly violent. I feel like he showed just enough to give you the idea of what was going on.
See, personally, I would consider this a violent film. I might even go so far as to say that this was the most violent of the films we've seen so far. Not in the literal sense where we're seeing the violence, but the violence. It actually felt violent. When you're seeing something happening in a Dead Alive, or Meet the Feebles or Bad Taste, the violence is so cartoonish that you're watching it, and it's meant to be funny, of course, but you kind of forget that it is actually violent. And for me, the implication of the violence here, just the fact that you feel the violence the whole time, and it's kind of brooding, and then when it actually happens, it just felt like a very honest, real moment. So even though there wasn't the scope of the violence, it wasn't blood flying everywhere, it felt the most realistic. It hurt, like when we get to that scene at the end, even though you're not seeing what's happening necessarily, for me personally, like I really felt the violence in a way I hadn't with any of his other films to this point.
Well, there's also the scenes of the fantasy killings that I think there's two of them. There's a couple throughout the film. They imagine, each of the characters imagines someone that they're talking to that they're not happy with being, basically killed by one of their fictional characters that they've imagined in their mind. And those scenes did stand out as a little more violent to me, and harken back to his other films, his earlier ones. But yeah, as you said, I mean, that's a good point. His films before this, he even said it. Actually, I was going to bring it up later, but I'll bring it up now. I watched an interview with Peter Jackson. He said in a documentary I was watching, it was a short documentary, but he just was talking about the film and the final scene in particular. And he said it was the one scene in the movie none of us wanted to actually shoot. And he also said it's not like the other films I've made. The blood and the gore is kind of funny. It's done for comedic effect. But in this film, it's not, and I just shut my eyes every time I watch it. Yeah. So I think that kind of says it all about the violence in this film.
And I wonder if it has anything to do with the fact that this was based on a true story, or if it's just the way the film was presented. Like, I'm curious if he would have felt that way, or if he would have treated the scene the same way had it not been based on a true story. Because with a filmmaker like Jackson, who's obviously not afraid to shy away from, excessive blood and gore, I have to wonder if there's a certain respect that he's paying to the real person and the real families by not showing that final scene, and if it had just been a fiction, if he would have taken it further or done it in a different way, and if that would have been more successful, or if it would have hurt it.
There's a certain reverence with this film. I agree. I think it's almost like he wanted to make sure he was very respectful because the people involved is still family members, that were alive, and obviously the two girls are still alive, and he didn't even interview them or speak to them at all when he was making the film. He just wanted to, make sure he was allowing them to have their privacy and all of that, which I thought was really respectful.
I'm curious if they've seen the film.
Yeah, I'm really curious
how that reaction
would
be.
Yeah, I'm really curious about that.
Because in a way, I just read a New York Magazine article. It just came out in the most recent issue it's called like What It Takes to Win an Oscar. And it's basically talking about, the direction things are going right now and how biopics, there was a big section about biopics. And in a way, this film, Heavenly Creatures, is a biopic. It's just, it's not the big sweeping narrative like you might see. Like there's the, what's it called? Darkest Hour with Gary Oldman is coming out soon as we record this on the first day of December in 2017. That it's about like a great person doing something big, and this this has more of that feel of the article I read talked about the ability of a biopic to change the way we perceive an individual who's still alive, or a historical figure who's no longer alive. And to me, this feels like a kind of dangerous biopic that is maybe treading on some new ground, because it's kind of, because we've had stories of serial killers before. We've seen Jeffrey Dahmer biopic, or Ted Bundy or something like that, but I don't know personally if I've ever seen a biopic where the main characters who do something atrocious are kids. So I just think moralistically this film treads on different territory.
And I think that's what's so compelling about it, is just how young they are. And maybe why Jackson has so much sympathy for them, or appears to have so much sympathy for them.
And he was a young man when he made this film. He was in his 30s. Yeah,
exactly. So I guess he could empathize with them. But I did think, you mentioned biopics. I think in this film he did a good job of giving you a good idea of what the lives of each of these girls was like. And the actresses, I mean, this is their first film for each of them, the main actresses, and they both did a fantastic job with the material, I thought.
Absolutely.
And, interesting to see how their friendship develops in the film, and of course where it ultimately leads. And yeah, I just thought the two actresses did a great job, and they really pull you in, and they make you believe that they believe in their fantasy world. And Jackson
Absolutely.
did a great job conveying that feeling with the camera. Like, the whole movie kind of has, you alluded to this a little bit, but it has like a dreamlike quality to it. The way he melds the fantasy world with the main characters in the real world. Sometimes the camera seems like it's almost floating through the air.
I think that dreamlike feel also maybe contributes to how brutal the violence feels at the end as well.
Exactly. Yeah. When it happens, right? Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, it has
So
almost like a have you seen the movie Sleepaway Camp, Mark? Of course,
I have
you
not
know you have
actually.
not.
It's on my
So we'll
it's on my
talk about
list.
that.
Yeah.
We should talk about that one on another episode. But it
We will.
has
Yeah.
a similar thing where you kind of drift through a dream, and then at the end of the movie, when you get something frightening or scary, it's all the more
Mhm.
frightening and scary because you've kind of been lulled into the state through
And
the
that
whole thing.
dreamlike state, yeah, it's I liked it also because it relates to the two characters and how they idealize certain things like Hollywood. They talk about Hollywood a lot in this film,
Hmm.
like the idea of Hollywood, And it's easy to imagine people getting caught up in a dream like that. Not unlike, I'm sure, Peter Jackson himself. Everyone has that mythic,
Fantasy.
fantastical view of Hollywood in a way, especially at a younger age. So I like how he also worked that theme into the film, with the way they idealized Hollywood and stars and things like that, and how they wanted to run away and make
Yeah.
that their life.
And it's interesting if we
Um,
look at what happened in these women in the lives of these two girls, and the real people I'm talking about. One of them, Pauline, kind of dropped off the grid. She wasn't really heard from.
yeah,
But Juliet Hume ended up being a mystery writer who goes by the name of Anne Perry, who was very successful actually, like
a
incredibly.
murder mystery writer.
A murder
Believe it or
mystery
not.
writer, and she got nominated for an Edgar Award at some point, which is a very prestigious, like she didn't just fall off, which was just kind of interesting um, to me that someone with that background could take that fantasy and turn it into something positive, and I think that's maybe just a testament to the fact that Jackson may have been onto something, that these girls weren't just they weren't just what the act they were known for. There was something more going on.
That's very interesting, and the fact that they went away for, I believe it was 5 years. They went to prison. At the time, they didn't know how long they were going to be in. I'm sure it felt like an eternity to them. But
Mm-hmm.
Getting out in 5 years for murder, a brutal murder such as this, you still have some time to turn your life around and try to do something with your life. And I feel like she really took that to heart and did make something out of herself, which is very interesting. And this is somewhat of I guess there's no really right answer to this, but I did want to ask you, Jeremy,
Mm-hmm.
would you consider the friendship between the two girls, at least how it's presented in the film, would you consider it unhealthy? Would you would you side with that view of things, or do you think, obviously taking out how it ultimately ended up, like, the way he
Yeah.
presents the friendship, how did you feel about it?
I mean, I think you're on dicey territory with a question like that because on the one hand, you could say that, children, because at this point, how old were they supposed to be in this film? Like 15 years old, 14 years old?
Around there, 14, 15.
14,
yeah, something
15.
like that.
Yeah, so they're
Yeah.
basically children. They're teenagers, but just hardly.
Mhm.
And I think that, people that age should absolutely be allowed to dream and have fantasies and play, in a creative,
Mhm.
fun way. But I do think it's difficult because the lines can be blurred sometimes depending on who is in that position. I mean, what this is kind of bringing to mind, which is obviously an equally dark real world event, is you look at the guys who did the Columbine shootings, and it was a similar situation almost where these two had this, they felt kind of alienated, like they were the only two who knew each other, and I'm making it clear I'm in no way trying to humanize, the people who
Mhm.
did Columbine, but it was a similar thing where they loved movies, they loved art, and they kind of used that as a thing to drive them behind their malicious deeds and to justify it almost. So I think that it can morally be an incredibly dangerous ground to tread on, but at the same
Mhm.
time, I think in the right hands, obviously, we probably wouldn't have Peter Jackson if we
Yeah.
stifled, a kid's ability to dream and fantasize.
Right. Yeah, there is a bit of a moral ambiguity there. It's we've all had friends who maybe you felt a kinship with as an outcast, and maybe who you felt very close to. But obviously, in this case, things took a very dark turn. Once they lost touch completely with reality, and they just confided in each other and didn't worry about anything else. That obviously things went in a certain direction. So yeah, it's controversial material. I think Jackson's take on it is somewhat controversial.
Mm-hmm.
In a way, because he is so sympathetic to them.
Absolutely.
So, but I think it's a great film. I really enjoyed it in the context of what you're watching. It's very different for Jackson. as we mentioned, the violence is not done in a comic way really at all, and it's just a very solid film with great performances. And I did want to ask Jeremy, what we talk about our moments that stood out to us, favorite moments we have. Was there anything in particular that stood out to you about this film?
Well, obviously, like we've discussed already, that final scene, just the way it was done with such tact, was really interesting to me. But also a thing that I found interesting was the army figures as the representation, because just visually, I thought that those were stunning. The plastic figurines that kind of turned in this fantasy world that they were seeing, which is interesting. I don't know if I read an interview or if I watched it, but at some point, what they were saying is that someone who knew Pauline Parker and Juliet Hume in that time had gone into one of their rooms and saw all these figures. And originally they were just supposed to be people in the movie, but somehow that got to Jackson, that they had all these little army figures, and he just turned it into this just absolutely stunning visual thing.
Yeah.
What about you? Do you have any specific moments?
I actually wrote down a lot of moments because there's a lot with the camera work and the performances that really stood out to me. The opening I thought was very effective. It shows stock or newsreel footage of the town that they live in, and then they have the sounds of the screams from the two girls come in and shatter that ideal setting. And the screams from the end of the film, which you don't know in the beginning. And I thought that was a really effective way to open the film and kind of bring you into everything. I also found it very interesting that they used Pauline's actual diary entries verbatim in the film. So that from
were they really?
Yeah, they were actually her actual diary entries. So I thought that was interesting. Yeah. Also, I just noticed there was a great use of montages in the film. There's a real energy to each of them, and the way he used snapshots, and he used different techniques. He was pretty creative with the montages, I thought, in this film.
Yeah. And I think that this was a major work as well, obviously for Jackson, but in terms of bringing him into the Hollywood community, I think, because I think Dead Alive had its cult following, but I think as much as it's easy to say it's all subjective and political, getting this Oscar nomination really opened Peter Jackson up to a new world of filmmaking.
It gave him a lot of clout, that's for sure.
Exactly.
People took notice of him after this, and also just another trivia thing I wanted to mention. I recently watched Zodiac again, the David Fincher film.
Yeah.
And I really like that film a lot. And
great film.
Something that David Fincher was very obsessive with the details in that film and how he recreated certain events and things like that. And much like that film, this film, Heavenly Creatures, almost all of the locations used for filming were the genuine locations where the actual events occurred. Yeah. So even the tea shop at the end where the mother ate her last meal before she was knocked down. Yeah, that was actually where they shot it. And
that's unbelievable.
Apparently that setting or that location was actually knocked down after, I think it was a few days after they shot that scene.
Wow.
So that's interesting just from a completely objective standpoint, just how they recreated things and shot them in the actual locations and things like that. So I found that pretty interesting.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah. So there's lots to dig into with this film. We're probably going to stop there just because
we go on for another half hour.
Another film to get to. Yeah. Another film to get to, but
essential viewing, I think. Heavenly Creatures.
Essential viewing. Yeah.
Essential viewing.
I would say it's even objectively probably the best. Well, my favorite of his films. So maybe not objectively, but
yeah,
probably
same.
my favorite. It's
of his early films or of his films period.
Well, actually, all in all, oddly enough, I think Meet the Feebles is my favorite, just from a pure entertainment standpoint. It's a very fun movie and lots of all the debauchery going on. But this film, I mean, as far as like a well-made film, the way it's written and acted and directed, I would say this is probably, for me, the best one. But so I did look into it a lot, and just to kind of end on this film, I like to mention when I watch certain behind the scenes or things or documentaries or interviews, I like to mention them here because I want people to check them out if they have the time. I actually went down, I mentioned this to you before we recorded, but I went down a bit of a YouTube hole with this film. because once I started looking things up about the, not only the film, but the real life murder case and everything, you can find all kinds of things to get into. But just to focus on Jackson and the film itself, I saw an interview with Peter Jackson that was around the time when the film came out, and I thought it was interesting because he talks about his previous splatter gore comedies and relates them to his new film and this new direction that he's taking. And I think it's, especially if you've listened to the last episode and you're wondering how do you get from those films to this? I think watching that interview will give you a little more insight into that, and we'll put a link in the description for this episode. And there's also some interesting facts in that interview about the case and the trial and his viewpoint on it, which I think is, like I said, it's a little controversial actually, the standpoint that he takes on it, but it's worth checking out. And there was also a behind the scenes documentary which was very short, but it was pretty good. It was pretty comprehensive for being so short. It's from 1994, and that's where I got the quote from, where he talks, Peter Jackson talks about the final scene in the movie, and that's worth checking out. We'll put a link to that as well.
Absolutely.
All right, that is going to do it today for us here at Cult Movie Cult. Please join us again next time, where we will be concluding our series on Peter Jackson, Before Middle Earth, the early films of Peter Jackson, where we look at our last late early film before Lord of the Rings, and that film is The Frighteners. So come back and hear us talk about that, and please check us out on iTunes, Instagram, and Facebook, various other forms of social media. You've been listening to Cult Movie Cult, where we watch and discuss the horrific, the obscure, and the flat-out strange from the other side of cinema. See you again next time on the other side.